You haven't even opened your eyes yet and you're already behind. Not to anyone specific, not for anything concrete, but the feeling is there, lodged in your chest like a permanent guest who never showed ID. The day hasn't even started, and you're already late in relation to a version of yourself that never existed outside your own head. You get up, you do what needs to be done. You push through the hours with the discipline of someone who believes the next delivery will close some invisible tab. The project ends. The deadline is met. The effort is real, measurable, verifiable. And then you pause for a moment, not to celebrate, but to breathe. And the feeling is still there, intact, not even scratched. You hit Monday's goal. By Tuesday, the next goal has already taken the space the previous one left behind. You never got to taste the first one. There was no time. Or maybe the taste never really came at all. And the question begins to take shape, slow and uncomfortable, in the moments when the outside noise quiets down enough for you to hear it. Is the problem in what you haven't done yet? Or is it in you? Sufficiency is a trap. Not because you're too weak to reach it, but because the criterion that defines enough has never been in your hands. That's what we're going to talk about. You're not the only one in this state. That matters to say, not as comfort, but as data. There's an entire generation that grew up learning that effort is the universal currency, that if you work hard enough, dedicate enough, want it badly enough, someday you'll cross a line and finally feel like enough. The promise was simple. Input generates output. You put in the effort, you reap the satisfaction. But what happened was different. The effort was put in. The satisfaction didn't appear in the promised proportion. And instead of questioning the promise, most people questioned themselves. If you've ever ended a year with more achievements than the previous one and arrived in December with that same vague feeling that you could have done more, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever received recognition you waited months for and realized, days later, that the weight in your chest hadn't gone anywhere, you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever looked at someone who apparently has what you want and thought, when I get there, it'll be different, and somewhere deep down, a voice whispered that it won't, you've already felt the structure we're about to dissect here. This isn't pessimism, it's a diagnosis. Observe the pattern with clinical attention because it has a precise geometry. The insufficiency you carry doesn't show up with failure. It shows up with success too. It makes no distinction. You fail and feel like you're not enough. That seems logical. You accept it. But you win, and it's there too, just wearing a different face. Now the argument shifts. You should have won by more, faster, with more grace, with less help, with more consistency. The criterion moves, always, with almost mechanical precision. Think about how you evaluate a day well lived. Is there a moment when you sit down, close your eyes, and think, today was enough? Or does your evaluation system work by subtraction? You take what you did and immediately subtract what you didn't do, and the balance always comes up negative. You're not lazy. Most people living in this state of chronic insufficiency are, objectively, the hardest workers in the room. They're the ones who arrive earliest, stay latest, don't let go of a problem until it's solved. The paradox is visible. The more you do, the sharper the feeling that it's not enough. As if the effort feeds the demand instead of satisfying it. This isn't a character flaw, it's structure. And structures have architects. So where does this criterion that never closes come from? Who sets the line that defines enough? Who moves it? And why does it always pull back at exactly the same speed at which you advance? There is an answer to that. It's 2,000 years old and was written by a man who commanded the greatest empire in the known world, had access to every pleasure and power that the civilization of his time could offer, and yet woke up every day to write notes to himself about the exact same trap you're living right now. He didn't write to be published. He wrote so he wouldn't forget. And what he didn't want to forget is the most precise diagnosis that exists for what you're feeling. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome between 161 and 180 AD. He wasn't a philosopher by trade. He was a philosopher by necessity. The most powerful man in the known world wrote to himself at night, after entire days spent managing wars, epidemics, rebellions, and the inevitable corruption that accompanies concentrated power. He wrote in Greek, not Latin, the language of philosophy, not the language of power, as if he needed a different tongue to think honestly. Those notes reached us as the Meditations, and they are not a leadership manual. They are not a productivity guide. They are the internal diary of a man who had everything the world could offer and spent his days reminding himself of one thing. Suffering doesn't come from lack. It comes from placing the criterion of sufficiency in something outside your control. He wrote this in different ways, over and over, as if he needed to constantly remind himself. You have power over your mind, not over external events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But not as a motivational maxim, as a structural diagnosis. He was describing a mechanism he observed in himself and in others, the transfer of the criterion of value to something that cannot be controlled. In 180 AD, the external criterion was the favor of the previous emperor, the opinion of the senators, the outcome of battles, the approval of the public. In 2026, the external criterion has changed form. The mechanism hasn't changed at all. Marcus Aurelius will help us see the code, not because he had the answers, but because he asked the right questions about the same problem you're living right now. Let's name the mechanism with precision before anything else. What Marcus Aurelius identified as the primary source of suffering wasn't pain, wasn't loss, wasn't failure. It was the surrender of judgment, the transfer of the locus of evaluation, in modern terms, from inside to outside. The moment when you stop being the arbiter of what is enough and start waiting for something external to issue that verdict. Observe how this works in practice. You finish a project after weeks of intense work. The project is good. You know it's good because you examined every detail, corrected every flaw you found, delivered the best your current capacity allows. And then you wait. You wait for feedback. You wait for the evaluation. You wait for someone outside to confirm what you, deep down, already know. And the time between the delivery and the response is a time of suspension. You're not satisfied with the work. You're waiting for permission to be satisfied. When the feedback comes back positive, the satisfaction lasts hours, sometimes less, because the system is already searching for the next verdict. When the feedback comes back negative or simply doesn't come, the emptiness grows disproportionate to the real evidence. You had 93 data points confirming the quality of the work and one point that contradicts it, and that single point occupies more cognitive space than the other 93 combined. Not because you're irrational, but because the system doing the judging isn't yours, it's theirs, and you abdicated your role as arbiter. Marcus Aurelius described this with a phrase that has been cited superficially for 2,000 years. Rarely does unhappiness have an external cause. Read hastily. It sounds like rigid stoicism, insensitivity to real suffering. Read carefully. It's a surgical diagnosis. Most chronic suffering doesn't come from events. It comes from the structure you use to process events. And that structure, when outsourced to the external, never produces closure, because the external was not designed to close. With every achievement, the criterion of sufficiency shifts in exactly the same proportion. You close the quarterly goal. The next quarter's goal is already being drawn up before you even take a breath. The system operates on a moving horizon. The finish line is not a fixed point in space. It's a function of how much you've advanced. The faster you run, the farther it gets. Marcus Aurelius identified the mechanism. Placing the criterion outside your control means handing the verdict to something that has no interest in issuing it definitively. The criterion moves because it needs to move. A criterion that closes is a criterion that is useless to the ones who built it. You don't compare yourself to one person. You compare yourself to a composite and selective version of multiple people, assembled from the most impressive fragments of each one. The colleague you admire professionally has a domestic life you don't see. The creator who seems unstoppable has an internal cost that isn't available for observation. But comparison doesn't use complete data, it uses excerpts. And the excerpt always places the other person at an advantage, because you have access to the totality of your own struggle and only to the display window of someone else's. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about this. Don't compare your internal condition with the external appearance of others. Not as moralism, as cognitive hygiene, because asymmetric comparison never produces a real diagnosis. It produces distortion that feeds insufficiency. External approval works like a currency with structural inflation. You receive a certain amount today, and tomorrow that amount buys less satisfaction than it bought yesterday. Not because you're greedy, but because the system of external approval operates through inverted hedonic adaptation. The more you receive, the higher the baseline rises, and the more you need to receive to achieve the same effect. This isn't a moral weakness, it's architecture. The external criterion was built to generate dependence on itself. A system that satisfies completely is a system that loses its user. The external criterion cannot close. Its permanent openness is its primary function. Now deepen the diagnosis. Marcus Aurelius wasn't prescribing indifference to the world. He was emperor. He made decisions about wars, about lives, about the fate of entire peoples. The choice wasn't between caring and not caring. The choice was, does the criterion of sufficiency for my actions reside inside or outside of what I can control? That distinction is more radical than it appears on first reading. It means that the external result, the recognition, the approval, the feedback, the favorable comparison, can be pursued, can be desired, can be valued, but it cannot be the final arbiter, because the final arbiter is the only point in the system that, when outsourced, generates that state of permanent suspension in which nothing closes. See how contemporary culture has industrialized exactly the most fragile point of this system. Productivity metrics were not invented to measure well-being. They were invented to measure output in relation to a target that can always be raised. When you internalize productivity metrics as your personal criterion of sufficiency, you adopt a system designed to never issue the verdict enough, because enough is the end of the metric's growth. Structural comparison, not the casual comparison that has always existed among humans, but the institutionalized, systematic, constant comparison across a wide field of carefully selected references, was not built to help you locate yourself. It was built to keep you in motion. A body that feels sufficient is a body that stops. A body that stops is a body that escapes the system. Revocable approval, the kind that can be granted today and withdrawn tomorrow without explanation, based on criteria that change without notice, doesn't generate security. It generates vigilance. You're not pursuing approval to arrive somewhere. You're pursuing approval to avoid losing what you already have. And what you already have can be taken away at any moment, because the rules of how it's granted were never transparent. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations in the 2nd century, but what he was describing has the same DNA as what you experience right now. The form changes, the mechanism is the same. Suffering that doesn't come from real lack, but from surrendering the criterion of judgment to something that cannot, by design, issue the verdict you need. And here is the point that most people can't see while they're inside the system. You're not failing at the game. You're playing exactly the way the game was designed to be played. The insufficiency you feel is not evidence that you're falling behind. It's evidence that the system is working. You were diagnosed as insufficient by a system that needs you to feel insufficient in order to keep operating. Let's name the mechanism with all the clarity it deserves, because this is the point where the vision shifts. The chronic insufficiency you carry is not a reflection of who you are. It is the logical and predictable product of a system of criteria that was architected never to close. Outsourcing the criterion of sufficiency means handing the key of the verdict to something that, by design, will never use it to lock the door. Productivity metrics exist to be raised. Your ceiling today is your floor tomorrow. Structural comparison exists to be fed. The more references, the more asymmetric the view. External approval exists to be constantly renewed. Any definitive approval would end the need to seek it, which would end the system. The design of the external criterion is the design of permanent openness, not by accident, by functional necessity. Marcus Aurelius identified this from a position none of us will ever occupy. The most powerful man in the world, observing that not even absolute power closes the external criterion, because the external criterion is never large enough. No matter what you accumulate, if the final arbiter lives outside of you, the verdict never comes. He wasn't preaching detachment from the world as a passive philosophy. He was describing the only architecture that produces closure. The criterion of sufficiency that can actually be inhabited by you must reside in the only space that remains under your control. The quality of intention, the integrity of action, the honesty of effort. Not the result. The result is outside. It always has been. The shift that needs to happen is not one of behavior. It's one of location. Where does the arbiter that says whether you are enough actually reside? If the answer is outside of me, you've just identified the mechanism that produces the feeling you carry every single day. Insufficiency is not the diagnosis of who you are. It is the logical consequence of where you place the criterion. Now the phenomenon is readable. You weren't failing. You were responding in a completely rational way to a system of criteria that was designed to produce exactly what you were feeling. The sense of permanent delay, the verdict that never closes, the finish line that retreats at the same speed at which you advance, that's not a character flaw. It's the predictable and inevitable response of anyone who places the criterion of sufficiency in something external to their control. Marcus Aurelius didn't discover this after a crisis. He discovered it managing the day-to-day of an empire. In council meetings, in military campaigns, in judgments and concessions. He saw over and over that the men who suffered the most weren't the ones who had lost the most. They were the ones who had handed the judgment over themselves to something that could not by its nature return it in any definitive form. And he wrote about it, to himself, not to publish, so he wouldn't forget. Because the system that produces chronic insufficiency has a specific characteristic. It is invisible while you are inside it. The feeling seems so yours, so intimate, so directly connected to your personal failings, that the idea that it might be architectural, that it might come from outside, from a design that has nothing to do with your worth, seems almost too convenient. It sounds like an excuse. It isn't. It's a diagnosis. The system needed you to internalize insufficiency as identity, because as long as you read it as identity, you keep chasing the external criterion that feeds it. Now look back with this diagnosis active. Every time you finished a cycle and immediately began building the next one without pausing, without a real evaluation of what was accomplished, you were obeying the rhythm of the external criterion, not your own. The urgency wasn't yours, it was the system's. Every time you compared your internal state to the external appearance of someone else and came away feeling behind, you used asymmetric data to issue a verdict about yourself. The verdict was invalid, but the feeling was real. Every time you worked to sustain an approval that had been granted and could be revoked, you were operating in surveillance mode, not action mode. The difference between the two is the difference between creating and defending, between advancing and protecting. The energy spent sustaining revocable approval is energy that goes nowhere you chose. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations for approximately 2 decades. It's the diary of someone fighting the same mechanism you're fighting. And what's striking isn't the wisdom, it's the repetition. He returned to the same themes week after week, as if lucidity was something that needed to be constantly reclaimed, not something you earn once and keep forever. Perhaps because the external criterion is constant, and awareness of the mechanism needs to be equally constant. You now have the name of the mechanism, you know how it was built, you know why it never closes. That doesn't change the system, but it changes where you look for the arbiter. And that is a difference that Marcus Aurelius spent 20 years trying to keep clear in his own mind, in a palace, with absolute power, and still needing to remind himself. There is a question that Marcus Aurelius never answered in the Meditations. He circled it, examined it from different angles, reformulated it in different words, but he never closed it. The question is this: if the criterion of sufficiency resides within you, what exactly is being judged? Not the approval you receive, not the position you occupy relative to others, not the volume of output you produce per unit of time. Then what? He wrote about intention, about the quality of what you put into each action, regardless of the result it produces, about the integrity of effort, not the magnitude of the return. But that raises a question with no easy answer. In a culture that measures everything by output and results, how do you develop an internal criterion of sufficiency that isn't simply disguised self-indulgence? How do you distinguish between a healthy internal criterion and a convenient rationalization for not demanding anything of yourself? That tension between the external criterion that never closes and the internal criterion that can, if poorly calibrated, demand nothing at all, is the real tension Marcus Aurelius inhabited. He was emperor. He had the power to demand nothing of himself. He chose to wake up and write to himself about the ways in which he was failing to be what he wanted to be. He didn't resolve the tension, he inhabited it. The question that remains is not how to feel enough. It's for whom or for what are you trying to prove that you are? Marcus Aurelius offers no relief at the end, and neither will this screenplay. Because lucidity doesn't work like a painkiller. It works like light. And light illuminates what was hidden, not necessarily what you wanted to see. You've spent this entire time inside a diagnosis, not of who you are, but of how the system you inhabit was designed to function. The mechanism has a name, the design has an intention, the insufficiency you feel has an architect. That doesn't resolve anything, but now you can see the code. And the question Marcus Aurelius asked himself night after night, after entire days spent governing the world, now that you can see the mechanism operating, can you keep believing that the verdict it produces is about you? If this diagnosis opened something you can't simply close, if the question stayed with you, that is the work of antidote, not answers, vision. If you want to keep seeing, subscribe to the channel. The next video is already being prepared.